Good afternoon. My name is Tracy Rosenthal. I am the Associate Director of the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. And I'm excited to welcome you to our organizational leadership series featuring a conversation with Dara Richardson-Heron, former Chief Patient Officer at Pfizer, and Adam Bryant, Senior Advisor to the Reuben Mark Initiative for Organizational Character and Leadership at CBS. Today's program is a featured event as part of our work with the Reuben Mark Initiative, which leverages the intellectual capital of Columbia Business and Law Schools to teach the leadership skills necessary to create optimal organizational cultures. Reuben Mark, the former 25-plus year CEO of Colgate-Palmolive, was a pioneer in creating a successful org culture, and his model is still used at the company today. We're lucky to have Reuben in the audience this afternoon. Throughout this series, we get the opportunity to host distinguished business and legal executives who share their effective leadership styles in congruence with their organization's strong cultures, and Dr. Richardson-Heron is absolutely no exception. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Adam Bryant, a three-time author and managing director at the EXCO Group, a senior leadership development and executive mentoring firm. Before all of that, Adam was a journalist for 30 years, spending 18 of those at the New York Times, where he interviewed more than 500 CEOs for his Corner Office series. Now, before handing it over to Adam, 2 points of housekeeping. If you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A box, which will be monitored throughout the event. And if you are attending today's event for PPIL credit, please check in using the link I will drop in the chat box. And be sure to submit your post-event reflection form to satisfy the community-wide mandate. If you're joining us from the classroom, my colleague Shirley will pass around a QR code for check-in. All right, thank you. And Adam, I hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tracy. And hi, everyone. Many thanks for joining us. I'm really excited about this webinar because I always learn a ton whenever I talk with Dara, and I know you'll get a lot out of this conversation as well. I'm going to start off the interview and then we'll get to your questions, which you can put in the chat as Tracy mentioned. I don't want to take up too much time with a long intro for Dara because it will take me 20 minutes to get through it. And you can read her full bio online. But what's important to know is that she is one of those people who has packed just a ton into her career so far. She's a physician. She's held top leadership positions at organizations such as YWCA USA, the National Institutes of Health, and more recently Pfizer, and just got my booster shot yesterday. So thank you. Dara, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Adam, with you.
That's great. So I want to start off just, your most recent role was at Pfizer, and I'm just curious what it was like sort of culturally to be inside a company where, the eyes of the world were watching Pfizer. There's that sense of urgency and expectation and mission. Just take us inside the company. What was that like?
Honestly, Adam, I actually accepted the role to join the Pfizer team long before COVID-19 was even in our lexicon. But I began onboarding in my role as Chief Patient Officer in February, just a few short days after the first patient to be diagnosed with coronavirus in the United States left the hospital. And 1 week before the Pfizer New York headquarters shut down completely. And we were all sent home to figure out, how to make it work with our new colleagues like Zoom, WebEx, and Teams. And so let me be clear, a pandemic presents far less than ideal circumstances for onboarding, but it was an exhilarating opportunity. And as for the corporate culture at the time, I think I can best describe it as equal parts innovative, empowered, customer-centric, and a strong focus on leadership excellence and results orientation. And for me, it was really one of the most exhilarating, challenging, and rewarding times of my career. And I think what stood out was that every single person in the organization was passionate, focused, aligned, and really in lockstep, working in partnership to do something that had the potential to change the world, in fact. And that created a lot of excitement, but also a lot of responsibility. And as for a few leadership lessons that I think saw during that time was, it's really important during times of crisis to figure out how to be part of the solution. I was a new employee, but it was no time for onboarding. It was time for me to get in the ring and participate and be part of the solution. And also another lesson for me was you got to assess, how to interact with your team and your colleagues during these critical moments. I was brand new, but critical moments like this require this all hands on deck mentality. And these are the moments when everybody, including short-timers, need to be focused on addressing, the emergencies at hand. And the one last thing I'll say in this is it's also important during these times for real, true leaders to know that in addition to dealing with the fire, if you will, it's also important to pay close attention to your team and what's happening in their lives and create a culture that makes them feel comfortable letting you know that they're not okay, because no one was exempt from the devastation that was caused by the pandemic. And there was really no one size fits all approach to getting past it. And we're still trying to figure all that out. So, I just say it was an exciting and exhilarating and a very, very rewarding time. It's rare for an organization to have the ability and the opportunity, I would say, to make an intentional decision to leverage the entire depth and breadth of the company. We talk about strategic priorities, and we usually have like 3 to 5. In this case, everyone was focused on this one goal, and it was absolutely necessary. And for me, it was an absolute honor to have a leadership role at Pfizer during one of the most unprecedented times in our world's history. And no doubt, it's going to be indelibly linked in my memory. And quite frankly, the results were magical and game-changing. And it was an amazing time.
That's great. That's great. So step back question. I mean, you have worked in so many different kinds of organizations, right? The YWCA, the National Institutes of Health, for-profit world at Pfizer. What is the common thread that runs through all of them for you in terms of making decisions about your next career move?
Yeah, the common thread for me is I'm a consummate student. I love learning, and I always love a challenge. So, I'm always scouting new opportunities. And once I find something of interest, I do my homework. I learn as much as I can about the opportunity. And if it aligns with my passion, my expertise, my goals, and my dreams to make a difference in the world, to make a difference or an impact because I'm here, then I do my best to gain an understanding of the culture and environment, though that's sometimes challenging as an outsider. But after a significant amount of due diligence, I just do a risk-benefit analysis, and I ask myself two key questions. One, will the new situation provide me with an opportunity to learn and grow both personally and professionally? And the second question I ask is, will the new opportunity provide me with the ability to leverage my time, talents, and expertise to make an impact? The answer has to be yes to both questions. And if it is, I move forward and I advocate for the role. But if the answer is no to either one, I pass on the opportunity. And just one other thing, I'm careful not to create arbitrary limits or boundaries on what I can do and achieve as an individual. And probably most importantly, I do my best not to allow anyone else to limit my potential. I'd love to share just a quick example. In one of my early leadership positions, although I was a top performer, I wasn't ever approached for the company's high potential leadership and developmental opportunities. And after a while, I just couldn't stand it. I decided to ask. And you'll never guess what I was told. I was told, and I'm going to quote, it said, "We thought you wouldn't be interested in considering leadership and development opportunities outside of the medical fields because you're already a physician," end quote. I was shocked. I mean, the HR team, they took it upon themselves to make that decision for me. They never asked me. As you might imagine, I wasn't happy with the decision, but and you may have heard me, Adam, describe myself as a physician by trade and an advocate by choice. This was really an important, pivotal time in my life where I had to advocate for myself. And I really, as a leader, I think it's vitally important that you make sure that you do advocate yourself and include that in your playbook. And, because most of my career has been outside of the box, and I've learned really invaluable lessons with each new experience. And I've taken them with me to each, opportunity that I've accepted, and it's served me well.
Yeah. And that story you told, I mean, this is great nugget of career advice. So what was the memo to self for you, and what advice do you give to others in terms of like, you need to advocate for yourself? Because some people do think that it's like, if I work hard, people are going to notice and I'll get rewarded.
Yeah, that's not the case. The old mantra is, put your head down and just do the work and someone will notice you. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. You've got to advocate for yourself. You've got to raise your hand for opportunities and really never allow anyone to stifle your potential. I've always had to advocate for myself. And sometimes you win, sometimes you don't, but you never stop, seeking out new opportunities, particularly if you have the skills, the qualifications, and the passion to do the job.
Right. And just one more question about that point. I mean, there is kind of a sweet spot there just in terms of, balancing this idea of patience, but also ambition, right? Because, I've interviewed enough CEOs, they talk about, there's some people fresh out of business school and they say, I want to be CEO in 2 years. It's like, you're not there, right? On the other hand, you can be sort of too patient. So in your mind, like, what was the framework for saying, I'm ready for this next job and I want to go for this next job?
Well, it's very interesting. Typically, and you've seen this in the literature, when a woman looks at a job description, if she doesn't have, one of the bullets, she'll say, oh, I won't apply. And oftentimes a male counterpart will look at it and they may have, 3 out of the 6, and they feel like, oh yeah, I should go for this. So I think there needs to be that balance. And particularly when I'm speaking to women, I make it clear, you don't have to have every box checked, but there is a requisite amount of knowledge and expertise that you should have before you put your hat in the ring. No one wants to be led by someone who, really doesn't have what it takes to lead, right? And we've all had that experience, and it's not pretty. So I think it's very important to look at the opportunity and make sure you have, a significant amount of the requirements. You don't have to have every one of them, but a significant amount. And if you do, put your hat in the ring. I mean, the worst thing that could happen is you get the answer no. And for me, the answer no means just new opportunity, so.
Yeah. That's great. So one of our colleagues at the Exco group has this great phrase he talks about the phenomenon of merging into traffic, which is sort of a great way of describing when you go into a brand new situation, either joining a new team or joining a new organization, and you've moved from, not-for-profits to government agencies to for-profit companies. What is the Dara playbook for merging into traffic and kind of figuring out the culture here and the politics? Because let's face it, there's politics everywhere. Like, how do you merge into traffic?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I do a fair amount of due diligence before I even get in the car, right? And that means I research the company. I try to learn everything I possibly can about the executive leadership team, but not just executive leadership team, the entire team as much as I can. I read news articles about the organization, try to figure out, what are some of the things, how is the organization perceived? And then I think about the particular role that I'm being asked to do. And again, I began pulling together all of the lessons and learnings that I have had in all of my prior careers and see which ones will be most applicable in the role. And then by the time I get to the point of being at an interview, I've already put together my 180-day plan of how I think I should be able to make an impact in the role. So when I'm during the interview, I generally discuss it. It's very simple. It's generally 1 page. And it has what I'll do on my first, pre-work before I join the organization, what I'll do on my first 30 days, my first 60 days, my first 90 days, and my first 180 days. And again, that will be based upon the job description and what I'm being asked to do. So every job whether, no matter what it is. I mean, I always pull together that 180-day plan of how I feel like I'm going to be able to make an impact.
That seems, I'm guessing that's pretty unusual. I mean, I don't know if you get feedback from the people when you go in these situations, but just from all my interviews with CEOs, so many of them have told me how unprepared people are. They come in for job interviews and they haven't done basic research about the company that they're interviewing for.
Yeah, and in fact, I can't, tell you how unusual it is because, fortunately, a lot of people when they come to interview with me because they've read some of my prior interviews on how I interview, they're generally very well prepared.
Right.
But I will say that when I pull out that one page, because you're gonna always get that question, what is it that you think you can bring to the organization? In one way, shape, or form, you're going to get that question.
Right.
So I have to tell you, I love it. I pull out my one, I'm glad you asked. I pull out my one sheet of paper and I have copies for whoever I'm being interviewed by. That's the other thing I do. I always, do research on the people who are interviewing me, if it's a panel or individuals. But I come in and I have my folder and I pull out that one pager and I walk them through it. And I will say people are very impressed by it. But for me, when you are seeking an opportunity, particularly a leadership opportunity, I think it's important to demonstrate what you are going to bring to the table. And to your point earlier about this kind of entitlement and people, thinking that just because they want an opportunity, they should be granted it. I don't ever subscribe to that. That's nothing that I've ever thought was appropriate. And I don't look too kindly, on people when they come to interview, with me. And I ask them the first question. It's always the first question I ask. I say, tell me what you know about the organization. If they can't give me a good answer to that question, sometimes I just stop the interview right there because it doesn't bode well to me for them as a leader and also as a person who really would do well on the team.
It must be an awkward moment.
It is.
You've got a little eject button under your desk that you press and
I just think that's a minimum you should do. I mean, you've got to know the organization.
Yeah. So switching gears, help us understand how you became you as a leader. I mean, when you think back sort of early influences in your life that really shaped your value system, that gave you your drive to achieve the success you've had, like take us back to those early years.
Adam, actually watching my parents lead both inside and outside of our home provided me with my very earliest influences and views on leadership. And fortunately, they provided exceptional leadership traits for me and my three sisters to emulate. I mean, they led by example for sure. And, the other thing is from very early on, it was clear that we all had our specific leadership roles to play on the family team. And my father was an accounting executive at a major telecommunications company. My mother was an executive home engineer. And she kept our lives and our household in order. And she made sure that all of us, my dad included, were organized and accountable. And, one of the things I think that really shaped my leadership and my leadership expectations was at our daily family dinners. My father would regularly share his leadership lessons and challenges and successes. And he'd let us know how he managed through it all. And trust me, some of those stories back in his day were not pretty at all. And my sisters and I at the time, we thought it was kind of a bit much to have to listen to these stories. But as we began to grow in our respective leadership roles, it became clear that my parents were intentionally curating these stories to provide us with timeless pearls of wisdom to help us lead in and navigate a sometimes unfair and inequitable world. And it was very interesting. In addition to my parents and other family members, I had the honor of watching and learning from many other great leaders and unfortunately, a few not so great leaders. Right. With the great leaders, I tried to make sure that I followed their example. And with the not so great leaders, I've been very intentional not to follow their example. And I think the lesson for me here is that and this is somewhat of a challenge for the virtual environment. More often for me, I watch a leader's actions rather than their words. That's what's had the most influence on me as a leader. And that's why I always do my very best to make sure that my actions match my words, because for me, demonstrating authenticity as a leader is so vitally important. So I would say my parents really influenced me most as a leader.
Yeah, what you just said remind me, I love that expression. You probably heard it. Your action speaks so loudly, I can't hear a word you're saying.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a challenge now for this virtual environment. Of course, we can see what people are doing, but there's nothing like being in an office, being in a boardroom, being, seeing what people are actually doing. So that's going to be interesting.
Yeah. And when you first started in leadership roles, I mean, leadership is so challenging, right? It's, infinite room for improvement. When I first became a manager when I was 26, I think I made every mistake in the book and invented a few. But when you think back on those sort of early leadership roles for you, what were some early memo to self moments, like don't do that or do this differently?
Yeah, some of my earliest leadership was as a resident in medical school. And I tend to be someone who, likes things to go very well. And some people may describe me as a bit of a perfectionist, but in my mind, when you are dealing with life and death, I think perfection is the goal. But there's a way to achieve it. And one of the mistakes I made, early on in leading, interns in the hospital setting was I was, hovered. I mean, I micromanaged because, I did not want to make a mistake at the risk of someone's health or their lives. Now, there are ways to do that. And I've later learned how to, give people freedom to do the work and not, micromanage it in that way. But back then, those were my earliest forays into leadership where the result could be life-threatening. And so that's one thing that I learned early on is, it's important to let people, form their own thoughts and opinions and approaches. And, when the stakes are high, it's okay to, provide advice and counsel, but let the people who you are trying to lead come up with their own ideas first and edit afterwards, as opposed to giving them the goal and all of the ways to get to the guidepost.
Gotcha. And I imagine there have been times in your career that you've faced some pretty strong headwinds because of your race and gender. I'm curious if you could share some of those, and also like what were the tailwinds that helped you navigate those headwinds?
Well, Adam, I'm a bit of a storyteller, so I just have to share I think another real life example that
Please.
is illustrative, of just one of the headwinds I faced in my career. Again, in one of my early positions, my immediate boss was an older male who seemed to have very little respect for women and women of color in particular. And during my first few weeks on the job, I noticed that he was very paternalistic to me in particular. I've described this and coined the phrase paternalistic micromanagement, and it's something that I was guilty of before, not in a paternalistic way. I did it because, it was a fear of life and death. His was, he just, he gave me the goal line and he gave me step-by-step instructions on how to get there. And it was clear he didn't give that same type of guidance to the other physicians on the team. And all of them were a bit older and male. And that just didn't sit well with me. And honestly, I don't think any person wants to be micromanaged. And certainly a true leader should always be open to input and suggestions, but most leaders just need to know where the goal line is, and they'll figure out how to get there, or they'll ask for help when they need it. So this was a tough situation for me, and it was a definite headwind. And I could have lost my cool and potentially risk and doing something that could jeopardize my leadership position in the company. But I got through it by leveraging the tailwind and lesson that was gifted to me and my sisters by our parents during one of our daily dinner conversations at childhood. And they said, understand that life is not fair and equal opportunities are not equal for everyone. And people may treat you differently because of your race or gender, but your role is to never allow anyone to stifle your ability or your achievements. And no matter what you face, you must strive for excellence in everything you do, and you'll win in the end. And that's always been my lens. That's been my tailwind. And, even though it's still painful every time it happens, because it happens, I wouldn't say all the time, but when I encounter unfair headwinds because of my race and gender, or for any reason for that matter, I have this built-in denial mechanism, and I use it as a tailwind to help me push through. And it always works out. And in this case, I just have to share, and I'm not gloating, I'm really not. But in this particular case, I push back where appropriate, and I focus my efforts on doing everything I could to make a positive contribution and add value. And you know what happened? I got promoted after 2.5 years on the job, and guess who became one of my direct reports?
Wow.
So, I'm not gloating. I'm not. But I have to tell you, it all works out in the end. What goes around comes around.
And was he comfortable reporting to you?
I would say no, but his options were limited.
Very diplomatically put. How do you, when you are facing headwinds, how do you decide whether to engage on something or to just power through it and not talk to the person? Like, what's your framework for saying, no, we're going to have the conversation?
Oh, well, to be honest, as a woman of color in leadership, if I tried to power through and have the conversation on everything that went wrong, I would never have time to do the work.
Right.
I think when something crosses a line as it relates to ethics, moral, utter disrespect, or lack of integrity, those things just, that's an automatic trigger. We're going to have the conversation. But if it's, some people call them microaggressions, I call them macroaggression. If it's a garden variety macroaggression, I just, move forward and, ignore it. But if I don't, one thing I've found is that people that tend to do that often are bullies, right? And if you don't stand up and make a stand, then, after the second or third time it happens, they'll continue. So I generally give people 1 or 2 opportunities. And then after the third time, I generally make it very clear that kind of behavior won't be acceptable for me. So it just depends on the gravity of the situation, but I pick and choose. I pick and choose the battles, because otherwise, I'd be in battles fairly often.
Yeah. No, that's great. So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions and just encourage everybody, if you've got questions for Dara, please put them in the Q&A chat box. I'm curious, you've done a ton of hiring over the years, Dara, and I know you shared that one of your questions is like, what do you know about the organization? But when you're deciding among job candidates, what are the qualities that you're looking for, and how do you get at those qualities? What are the questions you ask?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I asked that first question, and that could stop the interview. But after I make sure that the person has the requisite skills, experience, and expertise for the role in question, I spend a lot of my time trying to learn about the candidate as a person, as a human being, because those skills, integrity, honesty, those things you really can't train, right? You can't train for, you can't really develop. And so I may ask questions about the characteristics of the best leader they've ever worked for. And I often have them tell me about a time when they had a problem with a prior boss and how they handled it. And that just helps me understand what a problem is to them. And it also helps me gain a better understanding of their judgment. But I'm also curious about what drives them, what motivates them, what kind of environment and culture they feel is optimal for their success. And I always look for key team members who exude honesty, integrity, authenticity, and empathy. I'm also always on the lookout for team members who have a healthy combination of self-awareness and self-confidence. And it's tricky, but a healthy combination of those two things really always leads to a good employee. And one question I ask that gets to the self-awareness piece is the question that I always ask at the interview, and that's, how would you describe yourself in one word? And this question, and you know this, Adam, we've talked about it before, but this question forces the person to hone down everything they know about themselves into a single word. And people, tell me words like dependable, determined, authentic. That's actually my one word. And some people say complex. I don't judge people by their one word, but it always gives me insight into how people package themselves. And in every instance so far, everyone who I've hired has lived up to their one word. And it's pretty interesting. So I urge each of you, as you're thinking later today, come up with your one word. Adam, I still laugh every time I think about this question, because a while back you shared with me that a 9-year-old was asked this question if he was seeking employment, and he said his one word was unemployed. Right. And I thought that was hilarious. Right. Out of the mouth of babes, right?
Exactly. So for all the CBS students on this webinar, I mean, all of whom I'm sure have a healthy amount of ambition, what is your best kind of career and life advice? And it doesn't have to be one thing, but just given all the success you've achieved, all the experiences you've had, all that you've seen, what's your best advice for them if they want to get ahead and set themselves apart?
Well, first, I just want to say I love the name of this group, the Reuben Mark Initiative on Organizational Character and Leadership. I think that's so vitally important. And so as for career advice, I would say my best advice is to always lead with integrity and authenticity. You've got to know who you are and be proud of it. And, if you don't have confidence in yourself and your ability to lead, whether at work or at home, no one else will. And remember, I shared that my earliest leadership influences came from my parents. You never know who is watching you and following your lead. So make sure you're leading with character. Make sure you're leading by example. And just as a suggestion, I tell people to periodically ask themselves this question. And that is, why should anyone want to be led by me? And if you don't have a good answer for that, I really ask people to consider what opportunities they should to take to make sure that they're doing everything they can to excel at leadership. And if they aren't willing to put in the work, maybe leadership isn't right for them, because leadership is a very, very complex and dynamic experience if done well. And it takes a lot of hard work. And as for life advice, I also always like to encourage leaders to do what they can to reduce stress in their lives. It's interesting, and I'm talking to myself here too. In order to be a good leader, you have to put on your mask first and make sure that you're in the right frame of mind to lead with character and empathy. We can't do that if we don't make a concerted effort to remain healthy and reduce the stress in our own lives. And, I talk about it as breathing out chaos, breathing in calm, breathing out pain, breathing in peace, and breathing out sadness and breathing in joy and happiness. And I guess the last piece of advice is always express gratitude, even in this time and as challenging as everything is in the world. Despite the pressures and obstacles we all face, there's so many people who would love to be in our shoes, particularly people living in poverty right here in the US and those living in other countries who face unspeakable situations and circumstances that are far worse than anything many of us could ever imagine and hopefully will never experience. So that's, what I think, every day, despite what's going on, we should all try to think about and express gratitude in whatever way is meaningful for us. I heard this quote the other day and I really liked it. And it said, gratitude turns what we have into enough. And I really like that.
Yeah, that's a great expression. It's interesting, you mentioned authenticity a couple of times, and I'm always intrigued by those words because in some ways they're kind of big words, right? Like they can mean different things. And I think personally, I think a big component of being an authentic leader and being a trustworthy leader is that there's an element of consistency and predictability, right? That there's a sense of like, if you were my boss there, it's like, I know what your values are. I know the lines that you're not going to cross because they're important to you and you expect that of me as well. So, I mean, if you were going to be my new boss and I asked you that question, like, I guess I'm asking you to unpack what authenticity means for you, just in terms of like, what are the things that it's like, I'm not crossing that line. Like, this is important to me.
Yeah, so authenticity for me means that my words and my actions match. I present a set of core values in everything I do. And I care about the people who are working for me more than just what they can contribute in the work world, but how they, present themselves as human beings, right? So, authenticity, again, for me means that, whatever I ask of you to do, I will provide you with whatever you need. And I will give you feedback, both positive and constructive. But you will never have to guess where I stand because I'll make myself clear. I'll make our organizational goals clear. And we will celebrate together as a team. Everything I've ever accomplished has been the result of teamwork. No one, I don't care how smart, I don't care how much money you have, you really can't succeed without a team. So, I, make it clear that when you have me as your leader, you can always know that I will have your best interests at heart, and that I will always be there for you to support you, but also to provide constructive feedback so that together we can achieve whatever goals we set out to achieve.
Great question from the audience, touching on a theme that you mentioned earlier about advocating for yourself. The question is, Dara, I find it easy to advocate on behalf of my team and colleagues, but more difficult to toot my own horn. How do you balance advocating for yourself while still coming across as humble? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's really a great question. I'll say we've all seen people who are very comfortable, raising their hands for everything, and there are qualities in those people that I think true leaders would not want to exude. It gets back to the point that we were making earlier. You do have to have the skills, the experience, and the expertise. And you should have it before you raise your hand and before you advocate. But I think how you balance it is you look at whatever the opportunity is. And if you can clearly see that you have what it takes to do the job and you feel like you have the passion and the time and the wherewithal to get the job done, I don't feel that's tooting your horn. That's just presenting yourself and your skills and your credentials to achieve a goal. And the person on the other side of the table should be able to see it as well. So I never perceive when someone prepares, when someone has the requisite skills, experience, and the expertise, and they can state clearly, how they will, make a difference. I don't think that's tooting your horn necessarily. And I don't want to, honestly, I don't even want to put tooting your horn in a bad bag because I don't think tooting your horn is necessarily bad. If you do it too much, then that can be a problem. But really, that's just presenting yourself as a qualified person who's done the work and who's capable of excelling.
That's great. I'm sure you've done a ton of mentoring over your career. I mean, maybe people on your leadership teams, those moments where you sort of take them aside and say, I need to give some feedback, some advice. When you think about those conversations, what are the most common themes that come up in the mentoring advice that you give people?
Yeah, I think some of the common themes that come up is that some leaders have a challenge at creating clear, understandable, and actionable priorities for their team. And so that's a common theme. I think it's important, really, when leading a team, it's really important to have a clear and easily understandable vision, and also to work in partnership with the team to set those 3 to 5 goals. And I always say 3 to 5 because I think it needs to be a manageable number. So that's one common theme is when given advice, make sure that your team understands where you're going and that they are engaged and have had an opportunity to partner in helping shape the goals. That has always worked best for me. Another thing is, for the people who, back to the previous questions, who always raise their hands and they're always ready and always whatever, don't mistake words for voice. That's another common theme with some leaders I see. They feel like when they get in a room, they have to always talk, they have to always say something, and they just don't use their voices strategically. Some people just talk all the time to hear themselves speak. We've all heard them, we've seen them, and it's not good. And so that's another kind of theme. I tell people the smartest people I know are able to break things down in a way so that a kindergartner can understand it or the CEO of the company can understand it. So make sure that there's clarity in when you're using your voice, and use it strategically. Another thing that I like to talk, that's a kind of a theme is, it's important to be there for your team. And what do I mean by that? There's some people that, rise to a level of leadership above which they think, oh, I should never, ever have to be in the trenches. And I don't agree with that. I think it's really important for the leader to be willing to roll up their sleeves and get in the trenches. I think you get credibility. I think everyone understands that you really are a part of the team when you do that. And a lot of the advice that I've given to people, unfortunately, people think that, once they rise to a certain level, they should never have to do X or never have to do Y. And I just don't subscribe to that. I think no matter who you are on the team, whether you're the CEO or whether you're the administrative assistant, everyone has a role to play. And that goes really back to my training, in my family. Everyone has a role on this team. And just another, probably the final thing, because I could go on and on this, is I really feel that, great leaders are humble, they're inspirational, and they're engaging. And they're willing to put in the time and the work that is needed to build respect from their team members. And they should not expect that the respect is automatic, because it's not. But when you gain that respect by being in the trenches, by being there for your team, by supporting your team, providing them with the tools and the resources, it really has a trickle effect. And it not only enables your team to feel fully engaged, but it ignites excitement. And the word spreads, and others in the organization hear about it, and they see it and become energized as well. And before you know it, you have people like beating on your door and saying, I want to work for you. Do you have an opportunity? Do you have a position? But it's really a virtuous cycle. But those are some of the key things that I see when I'm advocating and talking to leaders and mentoring them. Those are really important ingredients in a leadership toolbox for me.
Great. Such great insights. I'm keeping my eye on the clock, and we do run an on-time airline here, so we're gonna wrap. But Dara, I could talk to you all day. Always enjoy our conversations. Always learn so much from you. And on behalf of everybody on this call, and I've been watching, nobody's dropped off, so you've kept them to the end. Just want to say thank you for your time and sharing your stories and your insights, and really appreciate you and your time, and thanks to everybody for joining us. So with that, goodbye.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Thanks so much, Dara.